Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey way back in time to a place where medicine was more about magic than molecules and a good time could get you thrown in a dungeon. We're diving into the strange world of how people got high in the Middle Ages and what they used to do it. Imagine you're wrapped in a scratchy woolen blanket, huddled by a fire that smells of peat and smoke. The world outside is a vast, dark forest, filled with more mysteries than maps. You hear the howl of a wolf in the distance, or is it a dog? Hard to say. Everything feels a little more primal, a little more dangerous. Tonight, you won't be sipping on some fancy craft cocktail. You'll be chugging fermented grains of questionable origin, or maybe gnawing on a root that might just make your teeth fall out. You probably won't survive this, but hey, at least you'll have a good story to tell the angels. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're a medieval peasant, or maybe a lowly apprentice, and you've just stubbed your toe on a loose cobblestone. It hurts. It really hurts. What do? Well, you don't have a bottle of ibuprofen in the medicine cabinet. Instead, you might find yourself at the local apothecary, which is less a CVS and more a glorified witch's hut. And the drug of choice for a throbbing toe or a raging toothache is often opium, but not the way you think of it. It's not some illicit powder sold in a back alley. It's a respected, albeit powerful, part of the pharmacist's toolkit. They call it laudanum, a concoction of opium, wine, and other bits and bobs, and it's considered a legitimate medical remedy. You'd get a small vial of the dark liquid, maybe with a mumbled instruction to take it with caution. Think about that for a second. Opium, in its raw form, was a perfectly normal, above-board solution to pain. Historians still argue whether the common person understood its addictive properties or if they just saw it as a temporary fix for their miseries. But what's for sure is that opium was a massive part of the medical landscape for a long time. It was the best thing a physician had for pain relief. They used it to numb patients for surgery, a gruesome affair, by the way. And even to soothe the wailing of a colicky baby. Can you imagine? Oh, your baby is crying. Just a little bit of the old opium tincture for them. That'll do the trick. It was a different world with different rules, and what we now consider a dangerous controlled substance was once just another tool of the trade. The poppy plant, in various forms, was a global commodity, traded along the same routes as spices and silks, making its way from the fields of Asia Minor to the muddy streets of London. You're a medieval person, so your life is, by modern standards, a festival of discomfort and pain. You have no proper dentistry, you have no aspirin, your diet is terrible, infections are a constant threat. So, a substance that could make all of that just go away for a while. It was a godsend. It was less about getting high for fun and more about a simple, desperate need for relief. A modern person might take a couple of Tylenol and go to bed. A medieval person might take a few drops of laudanum and hope they wake up feeling less like they were hit by a wagon. The line between medicine and mind-altering substance was blurry. If it existed at all, it was all just remedy. The purpose was to cure, to soothe, and to escape, even if just for a little while, from a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. So you've had your toe fixed up with a splash of opium-infused wine. But the pain is still kind of there, dull and throbbing beneath the blessed numbness. And besides, there's a feast tonight. Your lord is celebrating a minor victory over a neighbouring fiefdom, and as a good peasant, or apprentice, you're expected to be there, if only to applaud and maybe get a leftover bone to gnaw on. But what's on the menu? It's not a night for opium, that's for sickness. Not celebration, no. Tonight, the drug of choice is good old alcohol, but with a twist. The ale is thick and murky, likely brewed on site with whatever grains were handy, and it's less a crisp beer and more a liquid loaf of bread. It's not just a casual drink, it's a staple of life. Water, after all, is a breeding ground for all sorts of nasty things. It's crawling with microbes that could give you the kind of stomach bug that would make you wish for the Black Plague. So, people drank ale for hydration, not just for a buzz. It was a safer bet, but this isn't just about survival. The ale is also woven into the very fabric of society. At the feast, the Lord might raise a horn of it in a toast, a ritual that's as much a social contract as it is a celebratory gesture. The act of sharing a drink binds people together, a testament to camaraderie and fealty. The drink itself is an intoxicant, a social lubricant that encourages laughter, storytelling, and maybe even a little bit of dancing. This is where the term "was a bit high" really gets tricky. To us, it implies a certain state of being, a distinct alteration. To them, it might just be the natural state of things after a hard day's work. The line between a buzz and regular existence was a lot less defined, and as we remember from that first section, they're already taking some pretty potent stuff for medicine, so their tolerance and perspective are probably a lot different than ours. One of the quirky facts about this era is how religion and alcohol were so intertwined. Monasteries were some of the biggest and best brewers of ale, mead, and wine. Monks weren't just praying all day, they were also perfecting fermentation techniques. The production of alcohol wasn't seen as a vice, it was seen as a way to provide a safer drink for the community, and also as a source of revenue for the church. It was also used in a symbolic, sacramental way, of course, but a lot of the booze was just for everyday consumption. It's one of those things where we see the church as a very straight-laced institution, but back then, they were the top-tier brewers, churning out gallons of the good stuff. Historians still argue whether this was a shrewd business decision or a genuine act of public service, but either way, the monks knew their hops. The whole concept of getting drunk was also different. There was no shame in being a little tipsy at a feast. It was part of the fun. The stronger spirits we know today, like whiskey or vodka, didn't really exist yet, or they were in their infancy and used more for medicinal purposes than for recreation. The fermentation process was as far as most people got, so you'd drink a few tankards of ale, get a warm, fuzzy feeling, and maybe your sore toe would feel a little better. It was a gentle, slow descent into inebriation, a communal experience rather than a solitary binge. The alcohol was just a part of life, a safety measure, a social tool, and a way to forget, if only for a night, that you're a peasant whose life is mostly hard labour and rough wool. After a night of thick ale and lively, if a little slurred, conversation, you're back in your hovel, and a searing pain shoots through your arm. You must have twisted it while trying to dance a jig. Or maybe it was just a particularly aggressive handshake with your lord. Either way, it's bad. The local barber surgeon, who, let's be honest, is more barber than surgeon, says it's dislocated and needs to be set. He's got a big, scary-looking mallet and a handful of questionable herbs, but before he starts his handiwork, he offers you the soporific sponge. Sounds charming, right? It's a concoction straight out of a horror movie, and it's the closest thing they have to a general anesthetic. The word soporific basically means sleep-inducing, and sleep is what you desperately want right now. The sponge itself is soaked in a mixture that would make a modern toxicologist faint. You're looking at a blend of opium, mandrake, henbane, and hemlock. Yes, the same hemlock that killed Socrates. It's a literal brew of poisons and potent narcotics, all steeped together. The barber surgeon holds the sponge to your nose, and you're supposed to inhale the vapors until you pass out. The theory is that the fumes will put you into a deep sleep, allowing the surgeon to do his work without you screaming the hovel down. Of course, the dosage is a bit of a crapshoot, too little, and you're still awake and feeling every horrific crunch, too much, and you're in for a very permanent nap. This is where we get the term falling asleep. By the way, historians still argue whether this technique was more psychological than pharmacological, but one thing is certain, it was a terrifying gamble. Let's break down some of the ingredients. Mandrake, as we'll talk about later, is a plant with a root that looks vaguely like a human figure. It was believed to have magical properties, and its psychoactive effects were well known. Henbane is a deadly nightshade cousin, which we'll also revisit, known for causing hallucinations, delirium, and a complete loss of motor control. And then there's the opium, which we already know is a knockout. The whole thing is a cocktail of danger. A quirky tidbit is that the sponges were often dried out and stored in a special container, then re-soaked in warm water or wine before use. This meant the potency could vary wildly depending on how old the sponge was or how well it had been stored. You're literally inhaling a time bomb of uncertain power. The barber surgeon, with his clean-ish rag, might be the local authority on medicine, but his methods are based on a mix of tradition, folklore, and a touch of alchemy. He's not a chemist, He's just a guy who knows how to use a few plants to get a job done. The idea of getting high is completely absent from this scenario. This is pure, unadulterated necessity. You're not trying to have a good time, you're trying not to have your arm set while you're fully conscious. The only high here is the brief, hallucinatory trip you might take before you black out. And even that is a means to an end. The experience is more terrifying than transcendent. But when you're facing a dislocated arm and the only tools are a mallet and a sponge soaked in poison, you don't have a lot of options. You close your eyes, take a deep breath, and hope you don't wake up in the afterlife. Thankfully, you survive the soporific sponge and your arm is, for the most part, back in its socket, albeit with a fresh ache. But let's shift our perspective away from the individual and zoom out to a wider, far more terrifying phenomenon. Imagine a small town in the Middle Ages, maybe somewhere in France or Germany. One day, a few people start acting strangely. They begin to dance uncontrollably in the street, twisting and shouting, their movements jerky and spastic. At first, it's just a few. Then, a few more join in. Soon, dozens. Then, hundreds of people are all dancing, sometimes for days on end, until they collapse from exhaustion. This wasn't some kind of spontaneous rave. This was a real, documented phenomenon known as the dancing plague or choreomania. And it's a perfect example of what happens when a mind-altering substance enters the food chain without anyone knowing. The culprit. Ergotism. A disease caused by ingesting a fungus called ergot. This fungus grows on rye and other cereals, which, as we remember, are the very grains used to make the ale and bread that were staples of the medieval diet. Ergot contains powerful psychoactive alkaloids, including ergotamine, which is a precursor to LSD, so, without knowing it, entire communities could be consuming a powerful hallucinogen with every bite of bread and every sip of ale. The symptoms were horrific. In one form, known as St. Anthony's fire, it caused a burning sensation in the limbs, gangrene, and eventual death. In another, the convulsive form, it led to the kind of manic dancing we just talked about, along with hallucinations, seizures, and psychosis. It was a mass hallucination, a collective trip born not of choice, but of contaminated food. The dancing plague of 1518 in Strasbourg is the most famous example. A woman started dancing in the street, and within a month, over 400 people had joined in. They danced, and people died. The local authorities, thinking it was a fever that needed to be danced out, actually encouraged it, even building a stage for the afflicted. It's a tragicomic twist of fate that shows just how little was understood about the causes. A quirky historical tidbit is that some historians now believe that the dancing was not just a symptom, but also a kind of religious ecstasy or mass hysteria, triggered by the ergot and then amplified by the community's shared fear and belief in spiritual causes. The line between a physical illness and a supernatural event was, for all intents and purposes, non-existent. Historians still argue whether ergotism was the sole cause of the dancing plagues, or if it was one of several factors, including social stress and religious fervor. But there's no doubt that the fungus was a very real threat, lurking in the fields and barns of medieval Europe. The fact that a powerful psychedelic could be accidentally consumed by hundreds of people at once is a sobering reality check on how vulnerable people were to their environment. It's a good reminder that the highs of the medieval era weren't always a choice. Sometimes they were an unseen consequence of simply trying to survive. A dance with the devil that you didn't even know you were a part of until it was too late. You've seen what happens when nature takes a bad turn with ergot. But now let's talk about a plant that was intentionally sought out for its strange powers. Back in your medieval world, if you needed a potent cure, a mystical charm, or even a way to get out of a tight spot, you might go looking for mandrake. It's not a root from a children's fantasy movie, it's a real plant. And it was a really big deal. Its root often forks into two sections, giving it a vaguely human shape. This physical resemblance gave rise to all sorts of wild myths, like the belief that the plant would scream when it was pulled from the ground, a sound so terrible it would kill anyone who heard it. Naturally, people developed elaborate rituals to harvest it safely, often using a dog tied to the plant to pull it free. The dog, poor thing, was the one who was supposed to die from the scream. Mandrake contains powerful hallucinogenic and narcotic alkaloids, including atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscyamine. the same compounds we saw in the soporific sponge, in small, carefully measured doses. It was a potent painkiller and anesthetic. You might have seen it used in that soporific sponge, but it was also a go-to remedy for sleeplessness and other minor ailments. But in larger doses, it was a one-way ticket to a hallucinatory nightmare, causing intense delirium, visions, and a complete loss of touch with reality. You'd see things that weren't there, hear things that weren't real, and feel like you were flying. It was a potent substance, and it was respected and feared in equal measure. One of the quirky tidbits about mandrake is its role in medieval love potions and fertility charms. Because of its human shape, it was thought to be a powerful aphrodisiac and a tool for boosting fertility. A small piece of the root, worn as an amulet, was believed to ensure a long and happy marriage, or to help a barren woman conceive. It's a classic case of sympathetic magic, the idea that something resembling a human could influence human affairs. This is also where we see a bit of that light sarcasm and modern aside creeping in, because it sounds a bit silly, doesn't it? The belief in a screaming root that could get you pregnant or make you irresistible. But for them, it was as real as the cobblestones beneath their feet. Historians still argue whether the stories of Mandrake's deadly scream were a genuine belief or a clever bit of folklore to protect a valuable and dangerous plant from amateur harvesters. It's hard to say, but the myth was a powerful one, and it shows just how much people believed in the magical properties of the natural world. The use of mandrake was a high-stakes game. You could use it to ease a terrible toothache or, if you weren't careful, you could use it to take a one-way trip to a world of hallucinations from which you might not return. It was a tool, a charm, and a poison all in one. You had to be a master to use it safely. And even then, you were taking a terrible chance. The mandrake, for all its power, was a tool of both medicine and magic. But let's talk about another plant from the same family that found its way into a very different part of medieval life, the vanity box. Imagine you're a noblewoman in Renaissance Italy. Your life is a tapestry of arranged marriages, political intrigue, and a constant need to look your absolute best. You're not trying to get high, but you are trying to be alluring. So what do you reach for? A drop of a deadly poison known as Belladonna, or deadly nightshade, the name itself. Belladonna means beautiful lady, and it tells you everything you need to know about its use. The practice was simple. A woman would apply a small amount of the plant's extract, often in a diluted form, directly to her eyes. The atropine in the plant would cause her pupils to dilate, making her eyes appear larger, darker, and more luminous. In the soft candlelight of a ballroom, this gave her a captivating, almost otherworldly gaze. It was considered the height of beauty and allure, a way to signal to potential suitors and rivals alike that you were a woman of grace and sophistication. It sounds incredibly risky, and it was. The belladonna plant, from its berries to its leaves, is highly toxic. Ingesting even a small amount can lead to hallucinations, delirium, a racing heart, and, in higher doses, death. So, these women were quite literally playing with fire, or in this case, a deadly poison, for the sake of looking good. This is a perfect example of a substance being used for aesthetic purposes rather than for its psychoactive effects. Though the effects were certainly there, the mild doses used for cosmetic purposes might have caused a slight haziness or a feeling of detachment, but the goal was not to get high, the goal was to get beautiful. This quirky tidbit about belladonna's cosmetic use shows just how far people would go to meet the beauty standards of the day. It's a bit like our modern Botox, which uses a toxin to paralyze facial muscles, a risky procedure, but one that people are willing to undergo for the sake of beauty. The medieval belladonna was a similar kind of gambit, a trade-off of risk for reward. Historians still argue about how widespread this practice was. Was it a common trick used by most noble women, or was it a secret known only to a few? The evidence is mostly anecdotal, but the name belladonna itself is a powerful testament to its use. The fact that a plant with such a terrifying name and such a toxic nature became a beauty tool is a strange and fascinating chapter in history. It shows us that the line between medicine, poison, and cosmetic was incredibly thin. It also reminds us that the human desire to be seen as beautiful and desirable is a powerful one, strong enough to make people risk their very lives, all for the sake of a pair of captivating eyes. You've seen how some plants were used for vanity and others for pain relief. But let's talk about a plant that was, for a long time, just a really useful piece of greenery. Back in your medieval world, the plant we know today as cannabis was most likely not being smoked in a back alley. It was a staple crop, known as hemp, and it was used for everything from rope to sails to clothing. The fibers of the hemp plant are incredibly strong and durable, and they were essential for a society that relied on sailing ships and rough and tumble garments. If you were a sailor, the ropes on your ship were probably made of hemp. If you were a peasant, your rough tunic might have been woven from it. This is a mainstream historical fact. For centuries, cannabis was an agricultural workhorse, not a mind-altering substance. But that's not the whole story. You see, the same plant that provides those tough fibers also contains psychoactive compounds. The medicinal properties of cannabis were known long before the Middle Ages, with ancient cultures using it for pain relief, to ease childbirth, and to treat a host of other ailments. In medieval times, this knowledge persisted in the world of folk medicine. You might find a local herbalist who would use it in a tincture to soothe a stomachache or to help you sleep. The seeds were also used in food, and in some cases, the leaves were brewed into a tea. The use was largely medicinal, and the goal was to heal, not to get high. It was a folk remedy, passed down from one generation to the next. A quirky tidbit of herbal knowledge that existed alongside the more mainstream medical practices. Historians still argue whether medieval people were aware of the recreational, psychoactive effects of cannabis. It's hard to say for sure. On one hand, the plant was so common that it's hard to imagine no one ever figured it out. On the other hand, the strains grown for hemp fiber were likely not as potent as the strains grown for recreational use today. The goal was fiber, not flower. Plus, the methods of consumption were different. Smoking wasn't a widespread practice in Europe until tobacco was introduced centuries later. So, while a peasant might have accidentally gotten a buzz from a particularly strong batch of medicinal tea, it wasn't a cultural phenomenon, it was an isolated incident. The plant was a tool for survival and healing, and its potential for a high was mostly an afterthought, a side effect of its more practical applications. The legacy of hemp is a good reminder that a single plant can have many different uses. It's a plant that's been woven into the fabric of human history, literally and figuratively. It's been used for medicine, for industry, and, eventually, for recreation. But in your medieval world, it was just another part of the natural landscape, a reliable source of fiber and a gentle folk remedy. Its journey from a practical crop to a counterculture symbol is a story for another time. For now, you're just happy your new tunic isn't falling apart. The world of folk medicine and practical uses for plants was a vast, sprawling thing, a kind of botanical Wild West. But there was another, more organized kind of botanical exploration happening, a place where plants with psychoactive properties were studied and cultivated with a little more purpose. We're talking about the secluded, high-walled gardens of medieval monasteries. While you might think of monks as only being interested in prayer and calligraphy, they were actually some of the most knowledgeable herbalists and physicians of their time. They had access to ancient texts and had the resources to cultivate and experiment with a wide variety of plants, including many with mind-altering effects. In these gardens, you'd find a huge array of herbs, not just for cooking but for medicine. Monks would grow plants like belladonna, henbane, and opium poppies for their analgesic and sedative properties. They were, in a sense, the pharmacists of the age. They knew how to extract the active compounds and create salves, tinctures, and teas to treat everything from fevers to broken bones. The psychoactive properties of these plants were not a secret. They were a well-known part of their medicinal toolkit. However, their use was always framed within a religious and healing context. The goal was to soothe, to cure, to alleviate suffering, and not to get high in a recreational sense. They saw these plants as God's gift, a way to help those in need, and their use was therefore a sacred duty. One of the quirky facts about this is the way monks documented their findings. They created elaborate, illustrated manuscripts called herbals, which were part botanical encyclopedia and part medical textbook. These books contained detailed descriptions of plants, how to grow them, and what they could be used for. But they were often filled with a mix of genuine medical knowledge and outright folklore, including some of the wild myths we've already talked about. You'd find a page on the medicinal use of opium right next to a page on the screaming mandrake root. It was all a part of a single, unified worldview where the natural world was full of both practical cures and supernatural wonders. Historians still argue whether some monks may have experimented with these psychoactive plants for spiritual purposes, seeking to induce visions or a state of religious ecstasy. It's hard to say for sure, but it's certainly a plausible theory. In a time when the world was seen as a thin veil separating the living from the divine, it's not a stretch to think that some might have used these plants as a tool to cross that veil, but for the most part, their work was practical. The monastic gardens were pharmacies, not psychedelic playgrounds. Their knowledge was a blend of science, faith, and a healthy dose of superstition, all carefully catalogued and preserved in their beautiful books. A testament to a time when medicine was a far more holistic and mysterious practice than it is today. We've been focusing on the European side of things, but let's take a quick trip across a very wide ocean to a completely different world, one where the use of psychoactive substances was deeply embedded in religious and spiritual practices. We're going to the Americas, long before Columbus arrived, to talk about peyote and the ancient rituals of indigenous peoples. Peyote is a small, spineless cactus with psychoactive alkaloids, most notably mescaline, for thousands of years. Indigenous cultures in what is now Mexico and the American Southwest have used it in their spiritual ceremonies. The use of peyote was not a recreational pursuit. It was a sacred rite, a way to connect with the divine, to heal, and to gain spiritual insight. The ceremonies were highly structured and often led by a shaman or a spiritual elder. The participants would fast, pray, and then ingest the peyote in a communal setting. The resulting visions and altered states of consciousness were not seen as a high, but as a direct communication with the spirit world. It was a tool for divination, for understanding the mysteries of the universe, and for communing with ancestors. This is a mainstream historical fact, one that is still a part of some indigenous practices today. One of the quirky tidbits about peyote is the reverence with which the plant was treated. It was not just a plant, it was seen as a divine entity, a teacher, a medicine. The people who used it had a deep and abiding respect for it, and the rituals surrounding its harvest and consumption were full of songs, prayers, and offerings. This is a stark contrast to the often fearful or purely utilitarian use of psychoactive plants in medieval Europe. In the Americas, the plants were seen as a gift from the gods, a way to gain wisdom and healing. The use was holistic, and it was a core part of the cultural identity. Historians still argue about the exact origins and spread of peyote use across different indigenous cultures, but there's no doubt that its use was ancient and widespread. It's a powerful reminder that the human desire to alter consciousness is not just a European phenomenon, it's a universal one, but the why and the how are what make the stories so different. In one culture, it's a terrifying gamble or a necessary evil. In another, it's a sacred pilgrimage, a walk with the divine. The plant is the same, but the context changes everything. You're not just getting high, you're walking a sacred path. Now, let's head back in time, but this time to a culture that was both ancient and incredibly sophisticated. We're going to ancient Egypt, a civilization known for its pyramids, its pharaohs, and its incredible knowledge of the natural world. While you might not associate the Egyptians with getting high, they had a plant that was a major part of their religious ceremonies and, quite possibly, their recreational life. We're talking about the blue lotus, a beautiful flower that grew along the banks of the Nile. It wasn't just a pretty plant, it was a potent psychoactive substance. The blue lotus, scientifically known as Nymphaea caerulea, contains psychoactive alkaloids, including apomorphine and nuciferin, which can cause a feeling of euphoria, a gentle sedative effect, and a mild sense of heightened awareness. The Egyptians would steep the flowers in wine, creating a potent and intoxicating brew that was used in religious ceremonies and at social gatherings. If you were at an Egyptian feast, you might see guests being offered a chalice of blue lotus wine, a gesture that was both hospitable and spiritual. The resulting buzz was a far cry from the violent, manic dancing of ergotism. It was a more gentle, introspective kind of high, one that was meant to open the mind and soothe the soul. One of the quirky facts about the blue lotus is its symbolism. It was a hugely important symbol in Egyptian mythology, representing rebirth and creation because it would emerge from the water in the morning and close its petals at night. It was also associated with the sun god, Ra, and with Nefertem, the god of healing and beauty. So, when someone was drinking blue lotus wine, they weren't just getting high, they were participating in a spiritual act, a ritual that connected them to the very myths and legends of their culture. It's a perfect example of a substance being used in a holistic way, where the physical effects and the spiritual meaning were inseparable. Historians still argue about the exact nature of the blue lotus's psychoactive effects. Was it a strong narcotic, or just a mild sedative? The evidence is a bit murky, but the imagery on tombs and papyri leaves no doubt that it was a central part of their culture. You see it everywhere. From depictions of gods holding the flower to images of people at feasts wearing a lotus blossom on their heads. It's a testament to how a single plant could be both a beautiful symbol and a powerful tool for altering consciousness. The use of blue lotus was a way to blur the line between the physical and the spiritual, a gentle journey into a world of euphoria and divine connection. We've wandered from medieval Europe to ancient Egypt, but now let's talk about a group of people whose name is synonymous with ferocity and a kind of otherworldly rage, the Viking berserkers. These warriors were legendary for going into battle in a state of frenzied fury, often fighting without armor and seemingly immune to pain. The word berserker itself is believed to mean bear shirt, suggesting they would transform into wild beasts in battle. But what exactly caused this terrifying state of mind? It's a mainstream historical fact that their state was so intense it was considered supernatural, but the answer might have been a bit more botanical. One of the most popular theories, and a classic quirky tidbit, is that the berserkers were consuming a potent mushroom known as the fly agaric, Amanita muscaria. This distinctive red and white mushroom is psychoactive, but its effects are incredibly unpredictable and often dangerous. It contains a compound called muscimol, which can cause delirium, hallucinations, and a feeling of immense strength and courage, along with a complete disregard for pain. This sounds a lot like the berserker state, doesn't it? A warrior, fueled by this mushroom, might have felt like they were a bear or a wolf, and their fear would be replaced with a mindless, almost divine rage. This would explain why they would charge into battle without armor, as if they were invincible. However, historians still argue whether the fly agaric was the true cause. There are a few problems with the theory. For one, the mushroom's effects are highly variable and often include nausea and vomiting, which isn't exactly ideal for a warrior about to face a sword to the face. Other theories suggest that the berserkers were using other plants, or even that their rage was a result of a purely psychological state, a kind of self-induced trance brought on by ritualistic chanting and pre-battle stress. The idea of them chewing on a magic mushroom before a raid is a very compelling image, but the historical evidence is mostly anecdotal. It's a great reminder that the line between a supernatural explanation and a pharmacological one was almost non-existent to a Viking. A warrior acting like a bear might be an act of spiritual transformation, a blessing from the gods to a modern person. It might be the result of a powerful hallucinogen. The berserker's fury was their weapon. And it's a fascinating look at how a mind-altering substance, whether it was a mushroom or just sheer will, could be used to create a warrior so terrifying that his very presence could win a battle. You've seen how Vikings might have used a mushroom to go on a rampage. But let's talk about the more spiritual side of things. We're going back to the idea of a guide, a person who can navigate the spirit world and bring back wisdom. We're talking about shamans, and their use of psychoactive plants for journeys. Shamans existed in many cultures around the world, from Siberia to the Amazon, and they were the healers, the seers, and the spiritual leaders of their communities. Their practice was rooted in the belief that the natural world held a spiritual dimension, and that certain plants were keys to unlocking it. A shamanic journey wasn't about getting a cheap thrill. It was a serious, often perilous undertaking. The shaman would prepare with fasting, meditation, and ritual, and then consume a powerful plant brew. This brew could contain anything from ayahuasca in the Amazon to fly agaric in Siberia. The effects were not seen as a high, but as a way to travel to the spirit world, to commune with ancestors, to find lost souls, and to heal the sick. This is a mainstream historical fact, one that has been documented in countless cultures. The shaman was a spiritual pilot, and the plants were the fuel for their journey. One of the quirky facts about this is the way these spiritual journeys were described. They weren't a random collection of hallucinations. They were often highly structured, following a kind of internal map of the spirit world. The shaman would encounter spirit animals, benevolent guides, and malevolent entities, all of which had a purpose in the narrative of the journey. The experience was meaningful and purposeful, not just a chaotic trip. The plants weren't just a substance, they were a teacher, a guide, a key to a world that was just as real to the shaman as the physical world. Historians still argue about the exact origins and the global spread of shamanic practices. Was it a universal human impulse, or did the ideas spread from one culture to another? It's a fascinating debate, but the one constant is the use of plants to facilitate these journeys. The shamans of the past, with their knowledge of plants and their ability to navigate the spiritual realm, were the original psychonauts. They weren't using these plants to escape from reality, they were using them to get closer to a deeper, more profound kind of reality, one that was just as real and just as important as the one you're living in now. You've seen the shamans of the world using plants for spiritual voyages, but what about a less spiritual, more romantic application? Let's head back to medieval Europe, where matters of the heart were just as complicated and fraught with peril as they are today. If you wanted to win the affections of a fair maiden or a dashing knight, you might not just send a love letter. You might go to a wise woman or an apothecary and ask for a love potion. These potions were the medieval equivalent of a dating app, but with a lot more risk and a lot more questionable ingredients. The concoctions were a wild mix of herbs, spices, and a whole lot of weird stuff. A quirky tidbit is that many of the recipes called for things like mandrake root, belladonna, and other psychoactive plants we've already discussed. The theory was that a small, carefully measured dose could induce a feeling of giddiness, a sense of euphoria, or a heightened state of emotion that would be mistaken for love. The person drinking the potion would feel a little detached from reality, a little light-headed, and a little more open to suggestion. The love potion wasn't really a love potion, it was a potion of confusion and altered perception. This is a mainstream historical fact, though the efficacy is, of course, highly debatable. Another common ingredient was Spanish fly, a type of beetle that, when crushed, produces a compound called cantharidin. It was believed to be an aphrodisiac, but in reality, it's a powerful irritant that causes blistering and burning, and in large doses, it can be fatal. The whole idea was to create a physical reaction that would be misinterpreted as desire. It was a dangerous game, one that could land you in a lot of trouble. Historians still argue whether these potions were ever truly effective, or if they were a kind of placebo, working on the mind of the person who believed they were under a spell. The power of suggestion, after all, is a potent thing. The making of love potions was often tied to witchcraft and pagan practices, and if you were caught, you could face some serious consequences. The use of these potions was a moral grey area. Was it an innocent attempt at love, or a sinister attempt at manipulation? The answer, of course, depends on who you ask. But for the person drinking the potion, the experience was likely a strange one, a mix of physical discomfort and a hallucinatory trip, a cocktail of danger and desire. The search for love, it turns out, has always been a little bit crazy. We've talked about mandrake and belladonna, but let's talk about the original source of many of those magical and terrifying stories. Let's delve into the world of fungi, specifically hallucinogenic mushrooms. For thousands of years, different cultures have used these fungi in their spiritual and religious practices. They weren't just a food source, they were seen as a link to another world, a way to communicate with gods, spirits, and ancestors. The mushroom wasn't just a plant you found in the forest, it was a divine entity, a messenger from the heavens. This is a mainstream historical fact, one that is documented in the art and folklore of countless ancient cultures. One of the quirky tidbits about these mushrooms is their symbolism. They often appear in ancient art, sometimes as a stylized tree of life, other times as a guide or a teacher. The mushrooms themselves, with their strange and sudden appearance from the ground, were seen as a kind of spontaneous creation, a gift from the earth itself. They were a sign that the natural world was alive with a kind of magic that was just beyond human comprehension. The high they provided wasn't a party drug, it was a spiritual experience, a pilgrimage into a world of visions and insight. The mushrooms were a tool for introspection, a way to look into the depths of your own soul and the soul of the universe. Historians still argue about the exact role of these mushrooms in the development of religion and mythology. Was the idea of a god or a spirit something that was born from a hallucinatory experience? Was the concept of an afterlife and a journey to the spirit world a direct result of a psychedelic trip? It's a fascinating and provocative idea. The mushrooms, with their ability to dissolve the boundaries of the self, could have been a powerful force in shaping the human mind and the human soul. They could have been the catalyst for the myths and legends that have been passed down for generations. The symbolism of the hallucinogenic mushroom, in its art and its folklore, is a powerful testament to its role in the human story. The use of these fungi was a sacred trust, a knowledge that was passed down from shaman to apprentice, from elder to youth. It was a high-stakes game, and a dangerous one. But for many, the risk was worth it. The visions they provided were a way to find meaning in a chaotic world, a way to connect with a reality that was just beyond the grasp of the physical senses. The mushroom was not just a substance, it was a sacrament, a key to a world that was both terrifying and beautiful. You've heard of mandrake and belladonna, and you've heard of the mysterious properties of hallucinogenic mushrooms, but what if there was a single, magical concoction that combined all their power? We're talking about the infamous witches' salves, a dark and secretive part of medieval folklore. These salves were believed to be the source of a witch's power, allowing her to fly, transform into animals, or commune with the devil. But like so many other things in this era, the supernatural explanation had a very real, very botanical basis. A mainstream historical fact is that many of the plants used in these salves, such as belladonna, henbane, and datura, are from the Solanaceae family, the deadly nightshades. These plants contain powerful psychoactive alkaloids that, when applied to the skin, can be absorbed directly into the bloodstream. A quirky tidbit is that the salves were often applied to sensitive areas of the body, such as the armpits, mucous membranes, or even the genitals, where the absorption rate would be higher. The effect was a kind of deliriant high, a state of hallucination where the line between reality and fantasy was completely erased. The person would feel like they were flying, or like they were transformed into an animal, all while lying in their bed. The visions were incredibly vivid and felt completely real. Historians still argue whether the use of these salves was a genuine religious practice or a kind of self-induced madness. Was the witch a true believer, or was she just a victim of a powerful hallucinogen? The confessions of witches during the trials often described flying on broomsticks or meeting with the devil, which, when you think about the effects of these plants, starts to make a lot more sense. The salve wasn't a magic spell, it was a potent drug. The use of these salves was a high-stakes game. You could have a life-altering experience, or you could die from a miscalculated dose. It's a dark and fascinating chapter of history, one that reminds us that the line between a magical belief and a physical reaction was very thin indeed. You've heard about some of the most potent substances in the medieval world, but let's talk about something a little more common. You're in your kitchen, maybe stirring a pot of something savory over the fire, and you're surrounded by what we now think of as common household items. But in the Middle Ages, some of these could be used for a very different purpose. We're talking about spices. While they were a sign of wealth and were used to flavor food, some of them were also known to have psychoactive properties if used in the right or wrong way. A mainstream historical fact is that spices were incredibly valuable. The trade routes that brought things like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg from the East were a massive part of the global economy. But a quirky tidbit is that people also discovered that some of these spices could give you a different kind of buzz. Take nutmeg, for instance, in large doses. It contains a compound called myristicin, which can cause hallucinations, a feeling of detachment, and even a mild state of delirium. It's not a pleasant high, it's often accompanied by nausea and a terrible hangover. But people knew it could get the job done. The same goes for other spices, like saffron, which was also believed to have mind-altering effects in large quantities. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread practice or just a fringe phenomenon. Was it something a person would do on a dare, or was it a secret known only to a few? The evidence is mostly anecdotal, but the knowledge was definitely out there. People were constantly experimenting with the things around them, and if a spice could make you feel a little less miserable for a while, it was probably worth a try. It's a reminder that the line between food and drug was a blurry one. Your grandmother's spice rack could be a source of mind-altering substances, and all you had to do was use a lot of it. It's a bit of a laugh, isn't it? The idea of getting high off a bowl of nutmeg. But for some in the Middle Ages, it was a very real and very unpleasant possibility. You've just been introduced to the idea of getting a buzz from your spice rack, which is a fairly mundane kind of high. Now, let's go to the complete opposite end of the spectrum. Let's talk about the alchemists, the mad scientists of the medieval world, and their ultimate goal, to find the elixir of life. This wasn't about getting high for a few hours. This was about immortality. Their quest was a mix of proto-science, philosophy, and outright magic, and it involved experimenting with a whole range of bizarre and dangerous substances. A mainstream historical fact is that alchemy was a legitimate pursuit, a precursor to modern chemistry. Alchemists were trying to turn base metals into gold, but they were also obsessed with finding a substance that would grant eternal youth and life. This substance was the elixir of life, and the search for it led them to some truly strange places. They would work with metals like mercury and lead, and with a range of dangerous acids and concoctions. Their labs were often filled with strange smells, bubbling liquids, and the constant threat of a deadly explosion. A quirky tidbit is that many alchemists believed their work was a spiritual journey, a way to purify the soul as well as the body. The goal wasn't just physical immortality, it was spiritual enlightenment. Historians still argue whether the alchemists ever actually believed they would find the elixir of life, or if the search was a metaphorical one. Was it a genuine scientific pursuit, or was it a philosophical one, a way to understand the nature of the universe? The evidence is a mix of both. Some alchemists were undoubtedly charlatans, preying on the hopes of the wealthy and powerful, but others were serious scholars, laying the groundwork for the scientific method. The work of these alchemists was a high-stakes game. The substances they worked with were often incredibly toxic, and a single mistake could be fatal. The dream of immortality was a powerful one, but the reality was often a slow, agonizing death from heavy metal poisoning. Their quest, in a way, was the ultimate high, a search for a state of being that transcended mortality itself. You've heard of the alchemist's quest for an eternal high, but let's shift gears completely. We're going to talk about a substance that changed the world. But not because it made you trip. It changed the world because it made you not sleep. We're talking about coffee. Back in your medieval world, people were still drinking thick ale for breakfast, but in the distant lands of the Middle East and Africa, a new kind of social and intellectual stimulant was brewing. Its journey to Europe is a fascinating story of suspicion, controversy, and a whole lot of caffeine. A mainstream historical fact is that coffee beans originated in the Horn of Africa, where they were first used by Sufi mystics to stay awake during long nights of prayer. The drink then spread to the Arabian Peninsula, where coffee houses, or cave khane, became centers of intellectual and social life. It was a place where people could gather to discuss politics, poetry, and philosophy, all while sipping on a bitter, black brew that gave them a powerful mental boost. Coffee was a drug of the mind, not the body. It made you sharp, not sluggish. A quirky tidbit is that when coffee first arrived in Europe, it was met with a lot of suspicion. Some religious leaders called it a Muslim drink and tried to have it banned, but Pope Clement VIII, after tasting it, famously declared it so delicious that it would be a shame to let the infidels have all the fun. He baptized the drink, and it was officially okay to drink. Historians still argue whether the social and intellectual revolution that followed the spread of coffee houses was a direct result of the caffeine, or if it was just a happy coincidence. Did coffee create a new kind of intellectual class, or did it just give an existing one a more palatable drink? The evidence is a bit of both. Coffee houses became the places where the great minds of the Enlightenment gathered, and it's hard to imagine that the constant flow of ideas and conversation wasn't at least partly fueled by the steady drip of a new and powerful stimulant. The introduction of coffee was a high-stakes gamble for many. It was a drink that challenged the social norms of a world where alcohol was the default social lubricant. It was a drug of clarity in a world of confusion, and it changed everything. The coffee craze was just the beginning of a whole new world of stimulants. Now, let's talk about a plant that would have an even more profound effect on global culture: tobacco. back in your medieval world, the idea of smoking was completely alien. But across the Atlantic, in the same indigenous cultures that were using peyote for spiritual journeys, tobacco was a sacred plant with a very different purpose than the one it has today. It was a plant of ceremony, not a plant for a quick break. A mainstream historical fact is that tobacco was a core part of indigenous American rituals. It was used in religious ceremonies, in peace treaties, and as an offering to the gods. It wasn't smoked for a buzz, it was smoked to cleanse the body, to purify the soul, and to communicate with the spirit world. It was a plant of immense spiritual power, and its use was highly ritualized and controlled. The smoke itself was seen as a way to carry prayers to the heavens. It was a serious, solemn substance. A quirky tidbit is that when Europeans first encountered it, they were completely baffled. They saw indigenous people inhaling smoke and thought they were possessed by the devil. The idea of voluntarily putting smoke into your body was considered a sign of madness or sorcery. Historians still argue whether tobacco's powerful effects were purely pharmacological or if they were also a result of the ritual and belief systems surrounding its use. Was the feeling of tranquility and connection a result of the nicotine, or was it a result of the prayers and ceremonies? The evidence is a bit of both. The nicotine in tobacco is a powerful stimulant and relaxant, but the cultural context of its use was what gave it its true power. The initial reception of tobacco in Europe was a mix of curiosity and moral panic. It was seen as both a potential miracle cure and a dangerous vice. It was a new kind of high, one that was both social and solitary, and it was a harbinger of a new era of global trade and a whole new set of cultural obsessions. The journey of tobacco, from a sacred plant to a global addiction, is a long and complicated one. We've talked about the mysterious powers of the fly agaric mushroom and the possibility of Vikings using it to fuel their rage. Now let's head to a different part of the world to see this same mushroom in a completely different context. We're going to Siberia, a cold and unforgiving land where the use of this distinctive red and white mushroom was a cornerstone of ancient rituals. The use of fly agaric in Siberian shamanism is a mainstream historical fact, and it gives us a fascinating look at how a powerful hallucinogen could be used in a highly ritualized and controlled way. The shamans of Siberia, like the shamans we discussed earlier, used the fly agaric as a tool to travel to the spirit world. The mushroom wasn't just a substance, it was a sacred entity, and its use was a holy rite. The shaman would ingest the mushroom, often dried and consumed whole, and then enter a state of deep trance, communicating with the spirits, healing the sick, and guiding the community. A quirky tidbit is that the shamans and their apprentices would sometimes consume the urine of a person who had eaten the mushrooms. This wasn't as gross as it sounds. The psychoactive compounds in the mushroom are not metabolized by the body and are excreted in the urine. This meant that the urine was still psychoactive, and it was a way to get the effects of the mushroom without having to eat the whole and often nauseating thing. It was a kind of recycling program for hallucinogens. Historians still argue whether the use of fly agaric was the true source of all Siberian shamanism, or if it was just one of many tools in their arsenal. The evidence is a bit of both. The mushroom was a powerful tool, but the shaman's practice was also rooted in a deep knowledge of herbs, a command of ritual, and a lifetime of training. The high provided by the fly agaric was not a party drug, it was a spiritual tool, a way to connect with a world that was just as real to them as the physical world. The use of fly agaric in Siberia is a powerful reminder that the human desire to alter consciousness is a universal one, but the context and the meaning behind the high can be completely different. You've seen how shamans in Siberia used fly agaric, but now let's talk about another bizarre and dangerous substance that could be a source of a high. We're talking about a sweet treat, but one with a very bitter and hallucinatory side effect. We're talking about hallucinogenic honey. This isn't a mainstream fact, it's a quirky and fringe tidbit of history, but a fascinating one nonetheless. In certain parts of the world, particularly in the Black Sea region of Turkey and Nepal, there's a kind of honey that can make you incredibly sick or send you on a hallucinatory trip. The culprit is the nectar from specific plants, primarily rhododendrons, which contain a toxin called grayanotoxin. Bees that visit these flowers collect the nectar and turn it into honey, but the toxin remains. The result is a honey that, in small doses, can cause a feeling of lightheadedness, a buzzing sensation, and a mild sense of euphoria. In larger doses, however, it can cause nausea, vomiting, dizziness, and a drop in blood pressure. It's a dangerous game of dosage. and the line between a pleasant buzz and a life-threatening illness is a very thin one. This is a mainstream historical fact, by the way, that has been documented by ancient writers like Xenophon, who described his soldiers falling ill after eating this mad honey in 401 BC. Historians still argue whether the use of this honey was purely accidental, or if people knowingly consumed it for its psychoactive effects. Was it a substance of desperation, or a kind of high-stakes party drug? The evidence is a bit of both. The name itself, mad honey, suggests that people knew it could cause a kind of temporary madness. For some, the risk of a bad trip or a terrible illness might have been worth the potential for a new and strange experience. For others, it was an unlucky accident, a sweet treat with a terrible surprise. It's a good reminder that nature, in all its beauty, is also full of hidden dangers and unexpected highs. We've talked about mad honey and the hallucinogenic buzz it can provide, but let's talk about a family of plants that was the source of a lot of danger and a lot of bizarre highs. In the medieval world, we're going back to the deadly nightshade family, the Solanaceae. This is the same family that gives us belladonna and henbane, but it's a big family, and it includes a number of other plants that were surprisingly common in gardens and folk remedies, and they were all capable of producing a terrifying, deliriant high. A mainstream historical fact is that many of the plants in this family, like mandrake, henbane, and datura, contain powerful psychoactive alkaloids that can cause hallucinations, delirium, and a complete loss of touch with reality. A quirky tidbit is that people often didn't know how potent these plants were. They might have a henbane plant in their garden, believing it to be a harmless herb for a minor ailment, and a miscalculated dose could send them on a terrifying trip. The high from these plants was not a pleasant, euphoric one. It was a deliriant high, a state of confusion and terror where the line between reality and hallucination was completely erased. The person would see things that weren't there, hear voices, and feel like they were in a dream that they couldn't wake up from. Historians still argue whether the terrifying visions of witches and heretics were a result of these plants or a kind of mass hysteria. Was the witch's confession of meeting the devil a result of a deliriant high, or was it a genuine belief? It's a fascinating question. And the answer is probably a bit of both. The use of these plants was a high-stakes game. The dosage was incredibly difficult to control, and a single mistake could be fatal. The deadly nightshade family was a beautiful but terrifying part of the natural world, a source of both medicine and madness. It's a good reminder that the line between a cure and a poison was a very thin one, and a beautiful plant could be a source of a terrible, terrifying high. We've talked about dangerous substances, but let's lighten the mood a little, if we can. Let's talk about medieval parties. These weren't the raves of today, they were feasts. Gatherings of people who were celebrating a good harvest, a victory in battle, or a religious holiday. And while there was a lot of thick, yeasty ale being passed around, there were also some other, stranger beverages that people would drink. These weren't necessarily for getting high, but they were certainly for getting a buzz. A mainstream historical fact is that one of the most popular drinks at a feast was mead, a fermented honey wine. It's a bit like a medieval version of a cocktail, and it was often flavoured with spices and herbs to make it more palatable. A quirky tidbit is that people would also drink something called posset, a hot drink made from milk curdled with wine or ale, and often spiced. It was considered a kind of comfort food, a warm and soothing drink that would also give you a nice buzz. The whole point was to create a warm, fuzzy feeling, a sense of well-being that would make you forget about the cold and the dangers of the world outside. It's a bit of a laugh, isn't it? The idea of a cheese and alcohol cocktail. But for them, it was the height of comfort. Historians still argue whether the drinks at these feasts were ever truly potent enough to cause a deep state of intoxication, or if they were more about a gentle, social buzz. The evidence is a bit of both. The fermentation process was a bit of a wild card, and a good batch of mead could be a lot stronger than a bad one, but the point wasn't to get falling down drunk, it was to be social, to tell stories, and to sing songs. The use of these drinks was a high-stakes gamble in a way, too much, and you could be a social pariah, just enough, and you could be the life of the party. The beverages at medieval feasts were not about a mind-altering trip, they were about a social one, a way to connect with the people around you and to celebrate the brief, fleeting moments of joy in a very difficult life. We've been talking about the party-centric, social buzz of mead and posset, but let's shift gears and talk about something a lot more spiritual. We're going to talk about the role of hallucinogens in religious visions. For many people in the Middle Ages, the line between a dream, a vision, and a hallucination was very thin, and it was often seen as a sign of divine favor. A person who saw visions wasn't crazy, they were a prophet, and sometimes these visions may have been aided by a little botanical help. A mainstream historical fact is that many religious figures, from saints to hermits, were known for their visions. They would spend days in prayer and fasting, and then they would have a vision of God, the Virgin Mary, or a host of angels and demons. A quirky tidbit is that some historians now believe that some of these visions may have been caused by the use of psychoactive plants. Remember the fasting. Fasting itself can cause a state of altered consciousness, but if you add a bit of an unknown herb or a contaminated grain, the visions could become incredibly vivid and feel completely real. The person having the vision wouldn't think they were getting high. They would think they were communing with God. The high was a means to an end, a way to connect with a divine reality. Historians still argue whether the use of these plants was a deliberate part of a religious practice or if it was an accidental, unseen consequence. Was the hermit who saw demons in the desert a victim of a deliriant plant, or was he a true prophet? The evidence is a bit of both. The belief in a divine reality was so strong that the visions, whether they were induced by a plant or not, were interpreted as a sign from God. The use of hallucinogens in this context was a high-stakes gamble. It could make you a saint, or it could get you burned at the stake. It was a high that was not about a party or a buzz, but about a deep, profound, and often terrifying connection to a spiritual world that was just beyond the veil of reality. You've just been to the bizarre world of medieval religious visions. But let's take another trip back across the ocean to the Americas. We talked about how tobacco was a sacred plant, but let's delve a little deeper into its use in indigenous American tobacco rituals. This wasn't about a quick nicotine fix. It was about a profound, spiritual connection. The plant itself was seen as a living entity, and its use was a sacred trust. A mainstream historical fact is that tobacco was used in a wide variety of rituals, from healing ceremonies to peace treaties. The act of smoking tobacco wasn't about inhaling a substance, it was about releasing prayers into the sky. The smoke itself was a bridge between the physical world and the spiritual world. A quirky tidbit is that the tobacco used in these rituals was often a much stronger, more potent variety than the kind we know today, and it was often mixed with other herbs. The result was a powerful, mind-altering experience that was seen as a way to commune with the divine. The high was not a party drug, it was a spiritual tool, a way to gain wisdom and insight. Historians still argue whether the effects of the tobacco were purely pharmacological, or if they were also a result of the ritual and belief systems surrounding its use. Was the feeling of tranquility and connection a result of the nicotine, or was it a result of the prayers and ceremonies? The evidence is a bit of both. The nicotine in tobacco is a powerful stimulant and relaxant, but the cultural context of its use was what gave it its true power. The use of tobacco in these rituals was a high-stakes gamble in a way. It could bring you wisdom and healing, or it could get you in a lot of trouble with the spirits. It was a high that was not about a buzz, but about a deep, profound connection to a spiritual reality that was just beyond the veil of reality. We've talked about beer, mead, and posset. But let's talk about something with a bit more of a kick. We're moving from fermentation to distillation, and this is where the game really changes. The invention of the still, which was a mainstream historical fact that came to Europe through the Islamic world, allowed for the creation of much stronger spirits, things we now call liquor. This wasn't just about a gentle buzz anymore, this was about a powerful, mind-altering state. The process of distillation allows you to separate alcohol from water, creating a much more concentrated and potent liquid. The resulting spirit, which was often called aqua vitae or water of life, was initially seen as a kind of miracle cure. It was used as a medicine for everything from the common cold to the plague. A quirky tidbit is that people in the Middle Ages genuinely believed that drinking this stuff would make you live longer. They thought it was a magical substance, a kind of elixir of life that would ward off disease and death. Historians still argue whether the popularity of these stronger spirits was a result of their medicinal properties or if it was just because they got you drunk faster. The evidence is a bit of both. The spirits were a powerful medicine, but they were also a powerful intoxicant, and it wasn't long before people started using them for a bit of a party. The use of these stronger spirits was a high-stakes gamble. Too much, and you could be dead from alcohol poisoning. Just enough, and you could be the life of the party. A bit of a laugh. The arrival of distillation in Europe was a game-changer. It was the beginning of a whole new era of drinking, one that was both more dangerous and more potent than the world had ever seen. You've seen the potent effects of distillation, but let's go back to something a little more organic. We're going back to the plant that started it all, the poppy. We talked about opium in the first section, but let's take a closer look at the plant itself. The poppy, in all its colourful glory, has a long and complicated history, one that is deeply intertwined with medicine, pleasure, and pain. It's a journey from a beautiful flower to a potent medicine. And a mainstream historical fact is that it was one of the most important plants in the history of medicine. The poppy, Papaver somniferum, is the source of opium, a milky sap that is harvested from the unripe seed pods. This sap contains a number of alkaloids, including morphine and codeine, which are powerful painkillers. The use of the poppy for medicinal purposes goes back thousands of years, with ancient civilizations using it to treat pain, insomnia, and a host of other ailments. It was seen as a gift from the gods, a way to alleviate suffering. A quirky tidbit is that the poppy was also a symbol of sleep and death, with the ancient Greeks associating it with Hypnos, the god of sleep, and Thanatos, the god of death. It was a plant of both life and death, a powerful symbol of the duality of existence. Historians still argue whether the poppy's long and complicated history was a blessing or a curse. Was it a gift from the gods that brought a cure for pain, or was it a Pandora's box that unleashed a new kind of addiction? The evidence is a bit of both. The poppy was a powerful medicine, but its potential for abuse was just as powerful. The use of the poppy was a high-stakes gamble. It could bring you relief from your pain, or it could lead you down a path of addiction and despair. The poppy's journey from a beautiful flower to a powerful medicine and a dangerous drug is a long and complicated one, a story that is still being written today. You've just been on a deep dive into the poppy and its powerful dual nature. Now, let's talk about a different kind of pain, the pain of the mind. We're talking about medieval treatments for mental illness. Back in your medieval world, mental illness wasn't seen as a medical condition. It was often seen as a spiritual one, a punishment from God, or a possession by demons. The treatments for it were often brutal and terrifying, a far cry from the psychoactive plants we've been talking about. A mainstream historical fact is that people with mental illness were often subjected to exorcisms, rituals, and even torture. The belief was that the demons had to be driven out of the body, and the more pain you caused the body, the more likely the demons would leave. A quirky tidbit is that people also used a variety of strange and dangerous concoctions, including things like hellebore, a poisonous plant that was believed to be able to purge the body of its demons. The use of these substances was a high-stakes gamble. It could make the person sicker, or it could kill them. Historians still argue whether the treatments for mental illness were a result of genuine belief or a kind of cruel indifference. Was the person performing the exorcism a true believer, or was he a charlatan? The evidence is a bit of both. The belief in demons and spirits was so strong that the treatments, however brutal, were seen as a necessary evil. The use of these substances was a high-stakes gamble. It could bring a cure, or it could lead to a slow, agonizing death. The treatments for mental illness in the Middle Ages were a terrifying and brutal chapter in history, a stark reminder of how little was known about the human mind and its many complexities. You've just been to the dark and brutal world of medieval mental health treatments. But let's take a trip even further back in time, to a place where mind-altering substances were used for a much more spiritual purpose. We're going to ancient Rome, a civilization known for its orgies and its emperors, but also for its strange and mysterious rituals. We're talking about the use of hallucinogenic fumigations, a little-known but fascinating part of Roman life. A mainstream historical fact is that the Romans were big on divination, the practice of seeking knowledge of the future through supernatural means. And sometimes they would use a very special kind of smoke to help them get there. A quirky tidbit is that they would burn a mixture of herbs, spices, and other plants in a special room, creating a kind of smoke-filled chamber that would induce a state of altered consciousness. The person in the room would inhale the smoke, and the resulting visions would be interpreted as a message from the gods. The Romans weren't just getting high, they were seeking a divine connection. Historians still argue about the exact composition of the fumigations. What plants were they using? The evidence is a bit murky, but it's believed that they were using a variety of psychoactive plants, including some of the deadly nightshades we've already discussed. The use of these fumigations was a high-stakes gamble. It could bring you wisdom and insight, or it could lead to a slow, agonizing death from a miscalculated dose. It was a high that was not about a party or a buzz, but about a deep, profound connection to a spiritual reality that was just beyond the veil of reality. We've been to Rome and their smoky rituals, but let's talk about a much broader swath of history. We're talking about the drug use of ancient Greek and Roman civilizations as a whole. While they didn't have the same drug culture we do today, they were no strangers to altering their minds, both for pleasure and for prophecy. The most common psychoactive substance was, of course, alcohol. But they were also using a lot of other plants, some of which were incredibly powerful. A mainstream historical fact is that the Greeks and Romans used a variety of psychoactive plants in their religious rituals. The Eleusinian Mysteries, a secret religious cult in ancient Greece, were famous for a ritual that involved drinking a psychoactive brew called kykeon. A quirky tidbit is that historians still don't know the exact ingredients of this brew, but it's believed to have contained ergot, the same fungus that caused the dancing plagues. The use of this brew was a high-stakes gamble. It could bring you a profound spiritual experience, or it could kill you. The high was a way to commune with the gods, a way to transcend the physical world and enter a spiritual one. The use of these substances was a way to make the divine feel real. Historians still argue whether the use of these substances was a widespread practice or a fringe phenomenon. Was every Greek and Roman getting high, or was it just a select few? The evidence is a bit of both. The use of alcohol was widespread, but the use of more powerful hallucinogens was restricted to a few religious cults and secret societies. The use of these substances was a high-stakes gamble. It could make you a prophet, or it could get you in a lot of trouble. The use of drugs in these ancient civilizations was not about a party or a buzz, but about a deep, profound connection to a spiritual reality that was just beyond the veil of reality. We've just been through the history of ancient Greek and Roman drug use, but let's talk about a plant that is often overlooked in this conversation. It's a plant you've likely seen in gardens all over the world, but you may not know about its hidden and powerful properties. We're talking about morning glory seeds. This is not a mainstream historical fact. It's a quirky and fringe tidbit of history. For centuries, the seeds of certain varieties of morning glory, particularly Ipomoea violacea, have been used for their psychoactive effects. They contain a compound called lysergic acid amide, LSA, which is a close chemical relative to LSD. The use of these seeds was not for a party or a buzz. It was a spiritual and religious one, particularly in Mesoamerican cultures like the Aztecs. They called the seeds ololiuqui and used them in their rituals for divination and healing. The high from the seeds was a profound and spiritual one, a way to commune with the gods and to gain insight into the future. This is a mainstream historical fact. By the way, the use of these seeds was a high-stakes gamble. It could bring you wisdom and insight, or it could lead to a very unpleasant trip, with a lot of nausea and physical discomfort. The high from morning glory seeds was a long, strange, and often difficult one, but for many, the risk was worth it. Historians still argue whether the use of these seeds was a widespread practice or a fringe phenomenon. The evidence is a bit of both. The use of these seeds was restricted to a few religious cults and secret societies, but the knowledge of their properties was widespread. The use of these seeds was a high-stakes gamble. It could make you a prophet, or it could get you in a lot of trouble. The use of these seeds was not about a party or a buzz, but about a deep, profound connection to a spiritual reality that was just beyond the veil of reality. The forgotten history of morning glory seeds is a powerful reminder that a beautiful flower can hold a dark and mystical secret. We've just been through the forgotten history of morning glory seeds. But let's go back to medieval Europe and talk about the weirdest and often most dangerous part of medicine, the bizarre ingredients in medieval cures. This wasn't about a spiritual high or a social buzz, it was about desperation. When you were sick, you would try anything. And the medieval pharmacopoeia was a wild and terrifying place. A mainstream historical fact is that medieval medical texts, like the Leech Book of Bald, were full of recipes for cures that would make a modern person's skin crawl. A quirky tidbit is that these recipes often included things like crocodile dung, ground-up mummies, and even the blood of a red-haired man. The belief was that the power of the ingredient would transfer to the person taking the cure, so, if you wanted to be strong, you would eat something strong, like a lion's heart. It's a classic case of sympathetic magic. Historians still argue whether these cures were ever truly effective, or if they were a kind of elaborate placebo. The power of belief is a potent thing, and a person who genuinely believed they were taking a powerful cure might have felt better. Even if the cure was just a pile of dung, the use of these cures was a high-stakes gamble. The ingredients were often poisonous, and a miscalculated dose could be fatal. The person taking the cure was not getting high in the traditional sense, but they were taking a powerful trip. They were taking a trip into a world of magic and superstition, a world where the line between a cure and a poison was very thin. The bizarre ingredients in medieval cures are a powerful reminder that in a time before science, people were willing to try anything to survive, even if it meant taking a trip to the other side. You've just been through the bizarre world of medieval cures. But let's talk about a much more sinister use of poisons. We're talking about the role of poison in medieval politics. This wasn't about getting high or getting a cure, it was about getting rid of your enemies. The use of poison was a common and terrifying part of the political landscape, a way to eliminate rivals, secure power, and change the course of history without a single sword being drawn. A mainstream historical fact is that poison was a powerful tool for those in power. A quirky tidbit is that the poisoner was often a trusted servant or a family member, someone who had access to the victim's food and drink. The poisons themselves were often derived from plants we've already discussed, like deadly nightshade, hemlock, and monkshood. The goal was to make the death look like a natural illness, a sudden fever, or a stomach ailment, so that no one would suspect foul play. Historians still argue about how many people were actually poisoned in the Middle Ages. Was it a common occurrence, or was it a rare event that was sensationalized by chroniclers? The evidence is a bit of both. The fear of poison was very real, and it was a powerful tool for those who wanted to control others. The use of poison was a high-stakes gamble. It could secure your power, or it could get you executed in a very public and brutal way. The poisoner was not getting high in the traditional sense, but they were taking a powerful trip. They were taking a trip into a world of paranoia and suspicion, a world where the line between a friend and an enemy was very thin. The role of poison in medieval politics is a terrifying and brutal chapter in history, a stark reminder of how far people were willing to go for power. You've just been through the dark and brutal world of political poisoning, but let's talk about something a little more mystical, but just as terrifying. We're talking about the witchcraft trials and how the use of hallucinogens may have played a role. This wasn't about getting high for fun, it was about getting a confession, and the methods used were often brutal and terrifying. A mainstream historical fact is that during the witchcraft trials, many of the accused were tortured until they confessed to things like flying on broomsticks, meeting with the devil, and causing harm to their neighbors. A quirky tidbit is that some historians now believe that some of these confessions may have been influenced by the use of hallucinogenic plants. Remember the witches' salves? The same plants that were used in those salves were also being used by people who were being tortured. A person who was subjected to these plants would have a very vivid and terrifying experience, one that would feel completely real, and they would often confess to anything to make it stop. Historians still argue whether the confessions were a result of the drugs or a kind of mass hysteria. Was the witch's confession of meeting the devil a result of a deliriant high, or was it a genuine belief? The evidence is a bit of both. The belief in demons and spirits was so strong that the visions, whether they were induced by a plant or not, were interpreted as a sign from God. The use of hallucinogens in this context was a high-stakes gamble. It could get you a confession, or it could lead to a slow, agonizing death from a miscalculated dose. The witchcraft trials are a terrifying and brutal chapter in history, a stark reminder of how a little bit of knowledge and a whole lot of fear can lead to some very dark places. We've just been through the terrifying world of the witchcraft trials. But let's take a step back and talk about a culture with a much more nuanced and long-standing relationship with a psychoactive plant. We're talking about the history of hashish in the Islamic world. This wasn't about a terrifying trip or a magical potion. It was about a substance that was deeply woven into the fabric of society, used for everything from medicine to mysticism. A mainstream historical fact is that hashish, a concentrated form of cannabis, was used in the Islamic world for centuries before it ever made it to Europe. It was used as a medicine to treat pain and anxiety, and it was also used by mystics and Sufis to aid in meditation and to achieve a state of spiritual ecstasy. A quirky tidbit is that hashish was also a popular social lubricant, much like alcohol in the West. Hashish dens, or hashish khaneh, were a common sight in many cities, and they were a place where people could gather to smoke, tell stories, and listen to music. It was a social drug, a way to connect with others and to forget the stresses of the world. Historians still argue whether the use of hashish was a blessing or a curse. Was it a tool for spiritual enlightenment, or was it a dangerous addiction that led people down a path of self-destruction? The evidence is a bit of both. The use of hashish was a high-stakes gamble. It could bring you a profound spiritual experience, or it could lead to a life of addiction and despair. The use of hashish in the Islamic world is a powerful reminder that the relationship between a substance and a culture is a complex and nuanced one, and it's not always a simple story of good and evil. We've just been through the history of hashish in the Islamic world. But let's talk about a kind of high that doesn't require any substances at all. We're talking about the bizarre concept of spiritual drunkenness. This wasn't about a plant or a potion, it was about a state of mind. A kind of ecstatic religious fervor that was so intense it was compared to being drunk. This is not a mainstream historical fact, it's a quirky and fringe tidbit of history. In many religious traditions, from Sufi mysticism to early Christian ecstatic movements, people would aim for a state of spiritual intoxication, a kind of high that was born from prayer, meditation, and ritual. The goal was to achieve a state of union with the divine, a kind of transcendent experience that was so powerful it would cause a person to lose control of their body, to shout, to sing, and to dance in a kind of holy frenzy. The person wasn't getting high on a substance, they were getting high on God. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine religious experience or a kind of mass hysteria. The evidence is a bit of both. The belief in a divine reality was so strong that the feelings of euphoria and detachment were interpreted as a sign of divine favor. The use of this spiritual drunkenness was a high-stakes gamble. It could make you a saint, or it could get you in a lot of trouble with the authorities. We've just talked about spiritual drunkenness, but let's talk about a more physical and practical kind of magic. We're talking about the use of psychoactive plants in folk magic. This wasn't about a big, grand ritual. It was about the small, everyday charms and spells that people would use to protect their homes, to find love, or to ward off evil. And sometimes, these spells were aided by a little botanical help. A mainstream historical fact is that many of the plants we've discussed, like mandrake, belladonna, and henbane, were a core part of folk magic. A quirky tidbit is that people would often use these plants not for their psychoactive effects, but for their symbolic ones. They would bury a mandrake root under their house to protect it, or they would wear a sprig of henbane to ward off the evil eye. The plants weren't just a substance, they were a symbol, a magical tool that was believed to have a powerful influence on the world. Historians still argue whether the use of these plants was a genuine religious belief or a kind of superstitious habit. The evidence is a bit of both. The belief in a magical reality was so strong that the plants, whether they were psychoactive or not, were seen as a source of power. The use of psychoactive plants in folk magic was a high-stakes gamble. It could bring you good luck and protection, or it could lead to a slow, agonizing death from a miscalculated dose. It was a high that was not about a party or a buzz, but about a deep, profound connection to a magical reality that was just beyond the veil of reality. It's a powerful reminder that in a time before science, people were willing to try anything to survive, even if it meant taking a trip to the other side. We've just talked about the more mystical and magical uses of plants, but let's talk about a much more fundamental human impulse. We're going to talk about the human desire for escape. This isn't about a specific plant or a ritual, it's about the universal need to step outside of reality, if only for a little while. This is a mainstream historical fact, one that is as old as humanity itself. The use of psychoactive substances, whether it was a thick ale or a potent mushroom, was a way to cope with a world that was often brutal, painful, and terrifying. The high was a way to forget about the cold, the hunger, and the constant threat of violence. A quirky tidbit is that the desire for escape was often tied to the desire for community. People didn't just get high alone, they did it together. They would gather at feasts, at religious ceremonies, and in secret societies, and they would use these substances to bond with each other, to share their joys and their sorrows, and to feel a sense of belonging in a world that was often very lonely. The high was a social one, a way to connect with others and to feel a part of something bigger than themselves. Historians still argue about whether the desire for escape was a sign of a weak or a strong mind. Was the person who got high a coward who couldn't face reality? Or was he a brave soul who was trying to find a new one? The evidence is a bit of both. The use of these substances was a high-stakes gamble. It could bring you a sense of peace and belonging, or it could lead to a life of addiction and despair. The human desire for escape is a powerful and universal one, a story that is still being written today. We've just talked about the universal human desire for escape. But let's talk about the final chapter of our story. We're going to talk about the legacy of these substances today. The plants and rituals we've discussed didn't just disappear, they evolved. They changed, and they became a part of a new world, a world of science, of medicine, and of modern addiction. The story of a medieval peasant getting a buzz from a thick ale is a far cry from the story of a modern person drinking a craft beer. But the underlying human impulse is the same. The desire to alter our state of mind, to feel something different, is a part of who we are. A mainstream historical fact is that many of the plants we've discussed, like opium poppies and cannabis, are now a part of the modern pharmaceutical and recreational landscape. The alkaloids in the poppy are now a part of powerful painkillers, and the compounds in cannabis are now a part of a global industry. The ancient knowledge of these plants, once the domain of shamans and monks, is now a part of a multi-billion-dollar industry. A quirky tidbit is that the word berserk comes from the Viking warriors we talked about earlier, a reminder that the language we use today is still shaped by the stories and the substances of the past. Historians still argue whether the legacy of these substances is a positive or a negative one. Was the discovery of opium a blessing that brought a cure for pain, or was it a curse that brought a new kind of addiction? The evidence is a bit of both. The legacy of these substances is a high-stakes gamble. It could bring a new kind of medicine and a new kind of pleasure, or it could bring a new kind of pain and a new kind of addiction. The legacy of these substances is a story that is still being written today. We've just talked about the modern legacy of these substances. And now we're at the very end of our journey together. We've been to ancient Rome and medieval Europe. We've met Viking berserkers, wise monks, and desperate peasants. We've seen how people used plants and potions to find a cure for pain, a connection to the divine, or a moment of escape from a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. The stories we've heard, from the terrifying dancing plagues to the sacred rituals of shamans, are all a part of a single, universal human story, the story of our relationship with our own minds, and our endless search for a way to alter them. The final legacy of all of this, the biggest mainstream historical fact of all, is that the human desire for an altered state of consciousness is not new. It's not a modern invention. It is as old as the human story itself. We have always been explorers, not just of the physical world, but of the internal one. The plants and potions we've discussed are just the tools we've used on that journey. A quirky tidbit to end on is that many of the superstitions and magical beliefs we've talked about were not so much a sign of ignorance as they were a kind of pre-scientific logic. The person who believed that a mandrake root could protect their home wasn't crazy. They were using the best knowledge they had at the time to make sense of a world that was often nonsensical. Historians still argue about the moral implications of all of this. Was the use of these substances a sign of human weakness or a sign of human resilience? The answer, as always, is a bit of both. The high-stakes gamble of altering your mind has always been a part of the human story, and it's a story that we are still writing today. As we close this chapter, I want you to remember that the world we live in is not so different from the one we've just explored. We still seek a cure for pain, a connection to something bigger than ourselves, and a moment of escape from a world that can often be too much to bear. Now, as the embers of our virtual fire begin to dim, and the last wisps of smoke curl into the air. I want you to take a deep breath. Let the stories settle in your mind. Like dust motes in the final rays of a setting sun. The past is never truly gone. It's a part of who we are. A whisper in the wind. A ghost in the machine. Let yourself drift now. Let the thoughts fade. And just listen to the quiet hum of the world. The journey is over. The rest is just rest. End of script. Sweet dreams.